My name is Juan Parra Cancino, and I am starting to feel a little inadequate because I will talk about myself a lot, way more than I thought I would. But this presentation will have two parts. So first part will be the opposite what I've been told it should be done when you have 10 minutes, which is going from the particular to the global. So I'll go deep in from the contextual to the more, let's say, inceptual case study that I will play for you in the second part of the presentation. So this is what I will aim to navigate through. The first thing will be to give you a bit of context about the work that I've been doing for the last 15 years in with regards to understanding what can be presented as interpretation in electronic music today. So from the notions of reconstruction, reappropriation, and reinterpretation, I will gloss over a couple of case studies that you're welcome to visit on your own free time. Then I'll talk a little bit about the sources, how I am focusing, why am I focusing currently in early tape pieces from the 50s and 60s, and how that led me to the work of Éliane Radigue and the feedback works in particular. So first, the notion of the interpretation in electronic music starts from a long-standing frustration for me as a guitar player that worked for many years in the Institute of Sonology in The Hague, in Holland, where I was encouraged to look at my practice from, let's say, the development of the materiality of sound without intervening with my pre-existing instrumental practice. And that led me to search for ways where the electronic media could be perceived or could be imposed with the same constraints of a traditional instrument, not only when it comes to performing, but also in the all-important collaboration between people, between creative minds. Put myself at the service of someone else's musical ideas has always been my fascination, and the fact that the electronic media has a lack of standard to a certain degree has also made it very problematic. So that led to my PhD dissertation already very long ago, not that long, but 10 years, well, okay. Yeah, and I'm still, it's amazing how I'm still fighting with these things. But in a nutshell, the whole idea of trying to define what performance practice as one interpretation in electronic music meant led to try to understand the role of the electronic music performer as a three-headed monster, where, let's say, the composer, the performer, and the digital luthier or the instrument builder were indivisible roles that you had to navigate more than in other instrumental or musical practices. With that in mind, I aim to define three areas of interpretation that were informed or had more weight on one of these three roles. And that is how I came up with the idea of reappropriation, whereas the experimental interpretation is informed by compositional skills, which initially called reinterpretation, since it's about identifying salient creative factors and applying them to the resolution of musical problems in performance. The later, this idea of reappropriation was then combined for later work with the notion of gloss. I did this transliteration of works more often than I will be proud to confess. But the second aspect of interpretation in electronic music, I called it reinterpretation because it's informed more by performative skills, since it's about identifying interpretative challenges presented by a work and adapting them to the electronic media used in performance. And that I call now analogy. And the third aspect will be the more technical aspect, informing the process of interpretation. And that is basically connected to digital lutherie, instrument building, and other technical skills. Because it's about identifying the technical features of a particular setup in a particular work, and more importantly, identify the friction between the creative impulse and the limitations of the original technology, and how the recreation, not only of the positive features, but also the preservation of those original constraints in the setups, give the friction or the resistance that a traditional instrument will have for the electronic media. And the resolution or the exposition of that friction is what is presented in performance, and that is why we call it simulation. Now this is the speed test part of the presentation. One of the case studies where colleagues of CAT were involved very early on from Australia was the reinterpretation of solos by Karl-Heinz Stockhausen. This is a piece that originally was performed with a system like what you see at the top. Basically, it was one of the earliest pieces where tape loops were using for live performance, so not pre-recorded tape, but the tape delays were manipulated live. And of course, you see below what it can be done today, which is an iPhone app where you can play solo alone. And I'm not saying that that is wrong. I think that is a fantastic feat, but a lot is lost in that translation. What is lost is what I commit myself these days to investigate. But one of the things that I wanted to use was to not go in the way of the iPhone app, but still intervene with current technologies into the history of this piece. So after doing many interviews with technicians of the original set performances, one of the things that they found problematic was the features of the tape. So the hiss, the warble, things that nowadays we pay a lot of money for digital reconstructions. So music will connect to that time. So one of the technologies that today is in that same moment of uncertainty is telematics, is network technology. So I use telematics to reconstruct the work with focusing on the warble and the hiss of current network technologies as the flavor that was added. That was one aspect of it. The second aspect was that the history of this particular piece, solo, which is done for a melodic instrument that the performer needs to create their own version, their own score, and then the technicians follow a form scheme that indicates how the incoming signals are being processed in the delay system, was failed by design. And Stockhausen identified this as much as when the first recordings came out, there were things there that we wouldn't hear if a solo melodic instrument was generating all the sounds. There were electronic sounds incorporated, bits of other pieces incorporated, because what he wanted to do was to have a single instrument and the electronics extension to create polyphony as additive synthesis. And that doesn't really work. What you create is distortion. So what I wanted to do was to use the telematics also as a way of incorporating this polyphony by having multiple performers playing simultaneously, but not being audible at all times, but only in the sections of the piece where this polyphony should appear. Another case study that I worked with was Bruno Maderna's Hyperion. This was more of a straightforward process in terms of translating things from a compositional perspective into performative challenges. So the original piece is for orchestra, solo flute, and soprano. And this was a collaboration that I did with an Italian theater group, Muta y Mago, where they hired me basically as to replace the orchestra. So in this particular case, the process was a process of continuous reduction. So going from using live recordings of the orchestra conducted by Maderna to the replacement of the orchestral parts with electronic sounds. Not any electronic sounds, but electronic sounds that Maderna at some point during the compositional process of this work, actually, is that me? Yes. The compositional process of the work, actually he worked on creating a few tape loops that were used in only one performance of this particular piece. And I took those materials and expanded them ended up creating a whole new score to replace the orchestral part. And the third quick case study that I want to present to you today is Appear. It's a bit of a later piece. It's a Luigi Nono piece from the early 80s. And this is more in relation with the idea of reconstruction, or using the technical setup to preserve certain aspects of the piece. So the setup, it's very small up there, but it's a very simple setup of a reverb, 2 delay lines, and a harmonizer, and a multiband filter. But what is interesting is that this very simple setup has also this apparent simplicity has an inner complexity, and the inner complexity is related to the inner complexity that the apparent simplicity of the score of this piece, if you know the piece, it shows you. The piece is for double bass flute and double bass clarinet, and it's written in English quarter note 60, 4/4, and it's extremely simple to read as an music analyst. But if you are the performer, you realize that when you start trying to put the piece together, that there are certain challenges that are very, very unattainable. For example, these very low instruments are required to play at extremely soft dynamics in the extreme top range of their instruments. So the piece becomes about struggling to realize whether what is coming out of the speaker behind you is you or the other, or feedback, or what. And the electronics navigate and facilitate the confusion, the positive confusion of this work. Now, going a bit back in time to early electronic music, doing all these projects over the years made me realize that what I wanted to focus on and what I've been looking for is that spark, that friction where the initial setups are pushed by the creative intention of a composer at any given moment. And basically, I focus on that particular moment and try to capture it and translate it into live performances of these works. So the idea of going back to fix early electronic pieces, or let's call it early tape pieces, is to go back in a moment of time where the repertoire created, even before the ubiquitous implementation of control voltage, allow me to discover, by listening to the works, the moments where the performative moments of composers in the studio. So a filter sweep is a hand moving the filter knob. That's basically it. So those performative elements where the composer had to be a performer, more or less experienced, depending on your relationship with the studio, more or less distance in the sense of sometimes there were instructions and everything was planned out, but there was a technician in-house that had to perform all those tasks. And this for another presentation, the whole creative responsibility and ownership of the technicians that worked at those studios. That's for a later day. And in that process, of course, I have been looking at different case studies to work on, like Articulación of Ligeti, or some early studies of Lachenmann and Kagel, so composers that are not necessarily known for their electronic music, but they have produced something, and there's a source of friction and frustration there that for me is very interesting as material. And Éliane Radigue's feedback works. Why? Because I think that those works represent this tension between, let's say, the apparent simplicity of a setup and the richness of discovering what emanates as music from that simplified setup. My initial intention was to start working with Stress Osaka, also because of its failure history, but I ran into some time problems because I I have a relationship with Philips, so I'm trying to get the original format to understand what the technical limitations in terms of keys and frequency resolution of those tapes were, because I think that there's something in it. So I made a lateral move into the Usral. Why Usral? Because I think that and it's not casual that the previous presenter go to it as the pièce de résistance, as in the beautiful discovery that this piece is, and the almost, let's say, conventional or traditional musicality that it has. And for me, it was the perfect entering of this time machine and the understanding of interpretation in this way, very experimental interpretation, as a time machine that requires preparing materials and that requires diving into something that you don't know what will come out of. But in my case, was very important to come out with something that will serve as a way of amalgamating different aspects of Éliane Radigue's musical work and output in general, and of course my own expertise, which is electronic media. So from the get-go, I wanted to use Usral, analyze it, and create a score that then I could play using the sounds of the ARP 2500. So create a bridge between two aspects of the work. And I think that the to-do work will be that translation or that presentation on a stage should be more informed by her more recent works in terms of the composer-performer relationship. And that's something that I'm really hoping to learn in these 2 days a lot more about, beyond reading texts, which is always an entry point, but it's never the full story. So just extremely quickly, just to go through the processes of work that I did, I first used 3 different software techniques to using commercial software like Isotope, but also some more, let's say, experimental ways of using packages in Super Collider and Maximum Speed to separate the voices of Usral by frequency band, by timbres, by periodicity, so things that could be treated or tagged as more percussive. And then I did a number of spectral and pitch analysis per voice to isolate further, let's say, pitch material, central pitch material. Then I did a rough pitch material score that I took to Willem II Studios in Den Bosch. And I'm very grateful to Hans Kulk for giving me the time to work with him in understanding what are the limits of the ARP 2500 as an instrument. How can you do feedback operations in the instrument itself? So actually generate more sound sources than the evident. Also because I was going to translate it into something that I couldn't take and that I should be able to take on a train. So, and the most important realization in here is that up until that point, I was using a small keyboard to navigate at certain points to retune the piece. And after the experience using the keyboard of the ARP 2500 there, and listening to the piece over and over, I realized that that was the biggest point of conflict for me, which was that the piece, if it made sense as music to be performed, had nothing to do with the actual pitches that were there, but it was about having an initial tuning of relationships and navigating through those relationships to discover tones and beatings and play with that. So then I created still a reference score that I will be using today, and for that I'm using the Decibel Score Creator / Player, which took me a while to make it start in 0 and not right before 0, but that's for the tech support. And that's it. I hope I have 10 minutes to make an abridged version of the piece. Thank you.
Questions for Juan?
Yeah, really lovely performance. Congrats. I'd definitely be interested in hearing a long-form version of that at some point. But I wanted to ask, I mean, so much, if not all of Radigue's music, there's this like contingent nature of the materials relative to the music that's being expressed through the materials. And you touch on this a little bit with, for instance, like the qualities of the tape and how those qualities affect the music, or the tendencies of the ARP itself and how those come into play in the music. And Radigue is often trying to find the voice within these things. I'm really curious with like your instrument and your performance, if you've found like tendencies in your setup or in your instrument, and how you maybe explore the voice of the instrument and bring those tendencies into the foreground.
Yeah, I think that, well, I was happily surprised that, first, I thought that it was kind of a luxury, self-indulgent thing to go and play with the original ARP 2500 because an oscillator is an oscillator is an oscillator. But actually, working within the constraints of that instrument, I understood a lot better, like against my own musical intuitions, the importance of having control over the dependencies between the components of the synthesizer, and how feedback can actually help to keep this ratio. I don't want to get too technical, but there is one thing that the ARP 2500 has that no other synthesizer, historical of the time or slightly later, has, which is the ring modulator model. And it's not a real ring modulator, so what happens is that instead of giving you the difference and the sum of the two frequencies that you're putting in, it doesn't take away the original carrier frequency. So you have three pitches there. So you can do a lot with tuning relationships and having almost a chord playing throughout. And then the other thing that is interesting is that that same module has outputs to control. They're called ratio and tune. I guess you're all kind of familiar with these things. And one allows you to basically shift both carrier and modulator frequencies together, and the other one preserves the carrier at the same point, but the modulator can be slightly detuned back and forth. So that, in addition to passing the outputs of the oscillators through the filters, and then using the frequency of the filter to also change the frequency of the oscillator that is being ring modulated, basically brought me into a sonic territory that became very close to the kind of how do you say it? The open up or the defragmented Usral that I had to work with. Yeah, what I'm trying to say is that I did my best to use the ARP 2500 with its features as if it were a microphone and tape machines. And I normally do those things. I think that there's I guess that my best answer would be that as vague as it might sound, there has to be a reason to play this music today, and I guess that I'm closer to the line of historical performance practice that takes sources and materials as we have them and make an imagined music, rather than those that think that what is happening in those concerts is the way music was being done at the time. And of course, I'm putting myself out here because I'm into Bachland, but that was the point. The point was to be creative, to be experimental, and if anything was to learn the 2500 to use it as the tape machines. So that was the connection that I was trying to make.
Excellent, thank you.
Yo, two. Yep.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. Thanks very much. That was completely interesting from beginning to end. So I wanted to ask loads of questions, but just what you were just talking about, I thought your composition was really beautiful and really interesting to hear that next to the Usral, the tape version.
Mm-hmm.
And I just wonder that the difference is obviously, or maybe not obviously, but related to tape hiss and unpredictability of sound. Whereas you have something much cleaner. So now that we've moved into
it is
a cleaner perception of sound.
Yeah.
And I just want to connect that to something that I find interesting is that Éliane, when sound started moving into the cleaner digital domain, she didn't choose to go down that road. She chose to go acoustic. And I wonder if that's because her world is that unpredictable unpredictability of acoustic and tape recordings and the analog world, if you like. And also one very quick question, how many oscillators are you working with there?
Two,
right.
yes. So
which is the same as the ARP.
So
thanks.
just and I have everything but one of the oscillators as the copies of the ARP. So I wanted to keep as close as possible. So I also did, we all have these modular libraries at home, so I did a lot of listening to try to find something that was small enough to fit in there and that will sound like the 2500. But to go back to your question, the first thing, I think that, there's nothing super digital or criminal or predictable on what I'm doing. It's very raw and it's very rough.
But it has a clean sound.
It has its sound, yes. I that's why I was talking about the Stress Osaka. I think that one will. I'm not gonna do tape, but I think that I will focus much more in the fragility of the medium. There's something that I'm interested in, this idea of the medium is not transparent. There's a whole research group that Kat might get to know in February that is called Opaque Technologies inside of my workplace, and it's all about putting front and center the lack of transparency of technology in anything, in sound reinforcement, in composition, in the tools that we use to make music. So yes, I try to keep it in the sound of Radigue ARP as much as possible, but of course, unless we have, and I did record versions in the original ARP, and they are much rougher than this, of course. And so this normally I use it as a make gooder pedal, but now it's a make uglier, as in there's a bit of more saturation than the original module will have. But yes, maybe I can go further down that line. But with tape pieces, the problem is that our perception of them, or an analysis of them, navigates between the material and the carrier, almost indistinguishable. And I assume that if we were in the studio with Radigue, listening to her play the 2500, we can do without the tape hiss of the recordings of that work. That's my only cheap justification.
Did you?
Oh.
Yep.
Yeah. I've got one question, actually. This is quite fun. So there's kind of a friction between the tape works and the recorded tape works in a way, because the originals were these kind of endless, infinite, etc. And I kind of find there's like a similar tension in what you're doing in terms of creating a score for the performance and doing a performance. And I was just wondering, if you could talk maybe a little bit about that, what it sort of means to go from these infinite things which were already sort of compromised onto recording, which is how many of us, all of us probably experienced those works. And similarly to go from this sort of fixed score where you're working from pitches and pitch areas, and you talked a little bit about having to free yourself of that. But is there a further stage where you free yourself of that score even more, or how does that tension play out?
Thanks. Probably for Stress Osaka, I'll do without. That's why I got stuck, because I couldn't find the right instrument to play this live. The whole idea of making a live performance of these things is already a very bizarre, egocentric imposition. So if anything, what I'm trying to do is to add to the corpus of this work the same way that someone that plays Schumann Kreisleriana with or without knowing Roland Barthes' book will play it differently. So if anything, doing these things are a way to enter the piece from a different angle. So in that, because most of us know the fact that these pieces, as they are presented in the commercial releases, are not really what the pieces were about even, then that's when I started accepting that this is a a facsimile of a moment in time of that work. And my question was, what can I take from this material that is already mediated and bring other aspects of Radigue along the way? That's the thing. But certainly this was for this, and probably for the Nono, for example, just something that I'm working right now. The problem of is Omaggio a Vedova, and it was composed for, it's a 4-track composition, and it has been a lot of recent work in reconstructing the 4-track tape, but it was composed for the RAI for broadcasting, so it was always going to be mono. So I'm debating in terms of the spatial explosion or representation of this, and it would be very easy to say, the gift will be for more people to listen parts of this work mediated by me in the spatial dimension that they had originally. But what if the condensation is what the piece was really about? I don't know. Those kind of things. Sorry, that's where I take a break.
No, thanks. I appreciate the answer.
Yeah.
Any other questions for Juan? Yep, please.
Just a quick question. Did you say that you used the keyboard briefly with the R?
Yeah.
And then you jettisoned, you got rid of it?
Exactly, yes. Because
For the same reasons as Éliane?
yeah, I mean, for me, the let's say that while, I mean, this kind of diving into these materials is also a process of discovering the part of, why is it that I'm doing these things? Yeah. And from a performative perspective, what I wanted to preserve was the getting lost in the beatings of discovering these tones and letting them go in and out and play with the beating aspect of oscillators and filters feeding back. And the keyboard was when I was overemphasizing the value of staying close to the pitches of the original throughout the piece. So I was like, well, in this section here there's a chord, so I should be able to retune everything into that point. But whenever I was working like that, that moment was when I threw myself out of it. It's like, it has nothing to do with it. It has nothing to do with that particular chord. That it was not pre-composed, even a posteriori. It's not beautiful story after, like all the scientific findings. You have the hypothesis and the black box, and then this is my piece, and these are the chords that I discovered. I mean, if she was a academic under pressure, she would have been forced to come up with a theory behind those relations. But actually, it was not about that. So I took away the keyboard not to tempt myself and to focus on what it was important for me.
The translation between instruments is so interesting. So it points towards legacy as well.
Yeah.
And of course, classical music always had the tendency to have a piece of harpsichord that's transliterated onto brass band, etc., etc. I mean,
and it gives a bit of a less chauvinistic is the right word. Sorry, my English sometimes goes in and out. But to the whole cult of the objects, the material. I mean, we are all gearheads of anything, like the traversos, the recorder players, so if anything, it's always good to put yourself in a situation where you need to problematize why you need certain specific set of tools, and if those are to establish connections between different parts, in this case of Radigue, but for the Nono I'm doing something else, then it makes sense. It makes sense to actually go deep into the rabbit holes of getting this stuff.
Maybe if I can ask just one more quick one, which is sort of like just generally, you've already spoken about this a lot. But yeah, what's the responsibility of the, and this is the same in historical performance as you're suggesting, what's the responsibility of the interpreter to the, whatever the work may be, or the idea of the work, or to Éliane's original conception, let's say, and what is, where's the line between, it's like, well, when does it become a Juan piece? And obviously it's blurry, but how do you sort of, how do you think of this?
Yeah, I try not to get too worked out into those things, because if I'm trying to get a CD release, I will have to call it Juan, and if I'm, but for, I think that what is instrumental is that this particular performance could not exist without the work that I did directly onto the material that was Radigue's recording of that other work that had all other history. So I guess that I don't want to be negative, but my best argument is always try to put holes in the argument of Werktrauer, of traditional interpretation, because it's full of creative decision making. So in that, I will hope that and I'm not concerned whether this is my piece or it's a Radigue thing, but if anything, I will play this at the ICMC in China, and I will do it in a vintage materialities conference later on, and so on. And I will always frame it in with a composer and a repertoire that is not that well known. So if anything, these are kind of gateway drugs. I say it like that in different contexts, and for me, for me coming here, it's the other way around. It was my foot at the door to be able to get feedback and to get to know a lot more than what books can tell me of her work and the other people that are working around her. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Thanks so much, Juan.